wind ripped across the high Colorado peaks, howling like something alive and angry. Snow drove sideways against the log walls of the cabin tucked deep in the canyon. Inside, the fire burned low. A man sat at the table, alone. In his hand was a silver star, a United States Marshal's badge, the engraving nearly worn smooth, the back scratched and defaced by his own hand years ago. He turned it over once, then laid it face up on the wood. Outside, the mules in the lean-to stopped moving. Not to the sound of boots on crusted snow. More than one pair, moving with purpose up the trail that had been impassable for weeks. The woman standing near the stove did not speak. She simply closed her fingers around the cold brass letter opener. She kept on the shelf. It was dull. It had always been dull. But it was the only thing she had carried out of Denver that still belonged to her. The boots reached the porch. The man at the table stood. He put the badge in his pocket. And he waited. The dress was wrong for Denver in October. Wren Ashford knew it the moment she stepped off the train at Union Station. Navy wool, fitted waist, pearl buttons running from throat to hip. The kind of dress that said, "I belong somewhere important." She didn't belong anywhere anymore. The station smelled of coal smoke and wet leather and the particular desperation of people going somewhere they hadn't chosen. Stood on the platform with one trunk, one carpet bag, and a brass letter opener tucked into the lining of her coat pocket. Not luggage armor. Her father had been a careful man. Edmund Ashford built his fortune the way most careful men do. Slowly, brick by brick, over 30 years of surveying Colorado mountain land and buying shares in mines that other men were too cautious to touch. He had a nose for copper, a patience for waiting, and a weakness, as it turned out, for trusting the wrong people with the paperwork. He died in the spring. Heart, the doctor said. 61 years old. Sitting in his leather chair with a glass of brandy and the evening edition of the Rocky Mountain News, which was almost dignified until you read the fine print of his estate and discovered that Edmund Ashford had borrowed against every claim he owned, signed contracts he hadn't fully read, and left his daughter with a house that wasn't hers and a name that now meant debt. Edgar Price came 6 weeks later. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a coach that cost more than most men earned in a year. Black lacquer, brass fittings. A driver who didn't look at Wren when he opened the door. Edgar stepped out in a navy suit and a hat tilted at just the right angle, and he smiled the way certain men smile when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I believe we have matters to discuss." They did. He owned her father's debt. All of it. The mining shares, the surveying contracts, the mortgage on the house in Capitol Hill, with the rose garden her mother had planted before she died. Every piece of paper Edmund Ashford had ever signed with borrowed money had found its way into Edgar Price's leather briefcase. He sat across from Wren in her father's study. Her study now, technically, for another 30 days, and he laid it out with the pleasant efficiency of a man delivering good news. "The debt can be forgiven," Edgar said. "Entirely. All I require is a reasonable arrangement." Wren had looked at his hands, manicured, still, folded, on the desk like he had all the time in the world. "What arrangement?" she said. He smiled again. "Wear my ring. Smile for my associates. Be an Ashford in name while becoming a Price in practice. Not a question, not a proposal, a transaction." Wren had been raised to understand transactions. Boston finishing school, 2 years in Europe. She knew the language of arrangements made between families when money ran low, and appearances had to be maintained. She had watched her mother navigate that language for years with a grace that looked effortless and cost everything. So she said yes. She told herself it was manageable. A performance. She was good at performances. She would keep her father's house, keep the name, keep enough distance between herself and Edgar Price to make the whole arrangement bearable. She was wrong about the distance. The engagement lasted 4 months. She learned things in those 4 months. She learned that Edgar Price did not raise his voice, ever, which was worse than if he had. A man who shouts gives you warning. A man who goes very quiet and very still, while the temperature in the room drops 10 degrees. That man is the one who has already decided what happens next. You just haven't been told yet. She learned that he had opinions about her hair, her posture, the angle at which she held her teacup, the words she chose at dinner when his business partners were present. Small corrections, delivered pleasantly, with the patient consistency of a man training an animal he'd paid good money for. She learned to watch his hands when Edgar's hands went still. That particular stillness, fingers flat against the tablecloth, completely motionless. She learned to stop talking, stop moving, wait. And she learned, on a Thursday night in September, 6 weeks before the wedding, exactly what the contract meant. She had found the papers by accident. She hadn't gone looking. She was in his study retrieving a book she'd left there, and the safe was open. Not fully, just a few inches, and the papers were right there on top of the stack. Survey documents. Her father's signature at the bottom of 3 separate land contracts, transferring mineral rights to a holding company she'd never heard of. Dated 2 years before her father died. Before he took out the loans that buried him. Before. She stood there for a moment. Her father had been a careful man. Her father had not signed those documents. She recognized his signature the way you recognize a person's walk from across the street. Not by analyzing it, just by knowing. Edmund Ashford had a habit of pressing too hard at the end of his name, making the D drag slightly downward. Like he was reluctant to finish, like he was always a little uncertain even at the end of a thing. These signatures were clean. Even pressure, beginning to end. Not his. She took the papers, folded them, tucked them against her ribs inside her dress, replaced them with similar-looking pages from the correspondence drawer because her hands were shaking. But her mind was somehow very, very clear. She went back to the parlor and sat down with her embroidery. Edgar came in an hour later. He looked at her. The usual assessment. Quick, thorough. The way you check a room for anything out of place. You look pale, he said. Headache, Wren said. He accepted that. Sat down with his brandy. Read the paper. She embroidered an entire rosebud before her hands stopped shaking thing. 3 days later, she was ready. This was the part she had planned carefully. She was not impulsive. She was not reckless. She was Edmund Ashford's daughter, which meant she thought problems through and made decisions with the patience of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to use it. Cash from the household, safe. Not much. Enough. The original contracts, folded and wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into the lining of her carpet bag. The brass letter opener from her father's desk. Not a weapon. Not really. But heavy in the hand. Familiar. She left at 4 a.m. The house was quiet. The driver was asleep. She walked 6 blocks to the stage depot with her carpet bag and her one good trunk and bought a ticket on the first coach heading into the mountains. She didn't care where it went. Just away. The woman on the stage was named Mrs. Caldwell. She was perhaps 60. Round face. Kind eyes framed by spectacles. She wore a brown traveling coat and had a basket on her lap that smelled of cinnamon. She offered Wren a peppermint stick before they'd even cleared Denver proper. Long journey. Mrs. Caldwell asked. Going to visit family, Wren automatically. The lie already formed and waiting. Mrs. Caldwell nodded with the particular sympathy of a woman who had heard that before. Mountains this time of year, she clucked her tongue softly. You'll want to layer up, dear. It comes fast up there. The cold, she was pleasant, warm. She shared the corner of her lap blanket when the coach grew cold, and she had opinions about the best way to treat windburn, and she told a long story about a nephew in Leadville that Wren only halfway heard because she was watching the mountains get closer outside the wood and trying not to think about what happened when Edgar. Safe. Don't think about it, don't. They stopped at a relay station 3 hours out of Denver. Horses changed. Passengers could use the facilities and purchase coffee that tasted like boiled leather and cost twice what it should have. Wren climbed down, stretched her legs, walked to the edge of the station yard and looked at the range ahead. White peaks against a sky the color of pewter, clouds building fast in the northwest. That was when she saw it. Coming back toward the coach, she passed the station building, at the angle where the window faced the door, and, through that window not meaning to look, just catching a movement, she saw Mrs. Caldwell at the counter, talking to the station man, something passing between them. Small, folded, and then money. Coins from the way the man's hand closed. The station man looked at what Mrs. Caldwell had given him, looked up, looked directly at Wren through the window. Wren kept walking, steady, same pace, nothing on her face. Think right now description. She gave him a description. Your description. Wren climbed back into the coach, sat down, adjusted her bag on her lap, smiled at Mrs. Caldwell when the woman returned 30 seconds later with 2 cups of terrible coffee. So thoughtful, Wren said, taking the cup. Think she didn't reach for her carpet bag. That would signal something. She sat with her hands wrapped around the tin cup and let the warmth seep into her fingers, and she thought with the cold, organized clarity that had kept her functional in Edgar Price's parlor for 4 months. Mrs. Caldwell worked for Edgar, which meant Edgar had anticipated her leaving. Which meant the safe had been a test, or he'd noticed something in the days before she left, and this was the thought that turned her stomach to water. He had people positioned along every route out of Denver, which meant her money. Wren set the coffee cup down on her knee, shifted slightly, just enough to angle toward the window, and with 2 fingers she found the edge of her coin purse inside her coat pocket. The seam sliced clean. Oh, the purse wasn't there. The pocket had been slit so neatly she hadn't felt it. Before the station, probably. In the press of boarding, or when Mrs. Caldwell had leaned across her with the lap blanket. Wren looked out the window. The mountains were closer now. She still had the oilcloth packet against her ribs. She still had the brass letter opener. And she still had herself. Which was either enough or wasn't. And worrying about it wouldn't change the arithmetic. The coach left her in Coldwater Creek at 4:30 in the afternoon. Not on purpose, exactly. But not an accident either. The bald-faced truth was that when the driver announced that the pass ahead was closed due to conditions, and all passengers for points north would need to wait for the next coach in 3 days or find their own way, and when Wren had quietly explained her situation to the driver, no coin. A long story involving a misunderstanding with her luggage at the last station. The driver had looked at her with the flat professional sympathy of a man who could not help her and knew it, and had stopped feeling bad about it sometime around 1868. "Sorry, miss," he said, and he was. In the distant, moving on way of a man with a schedule, the coach pulled away. Wren stood in the street of Coldwater Creek, with her carpet bag and her trunk, and the wind coming off the mountain, like something alive and very, very angry. The town was small. That was being generous. It was a single main street of wooden buildings that had been thrown up fast during the silver boom, and not much improved since. A general mercantile, a saloon, an assay office, a building with no sign that might have been a hotel or might have been a warehouse. Hard to tell from the outside. The mud in the street was boot-top deep and the color of old iron. The cold had teeth. It bit through Wren's navy wool coat like the fabric was nothing, found her shoulders and her collarbone and the thin skin behind her knees, and settled in like it intended to stay. All right. Think. The mercantile first. She pushed open the heavy door and was halfway through explaining her situation to the man behind the counter. A tired-looking man in a canvas apron who had the air of someone who had heard everything and was not moved by any of it. When he told her the credit policy, which was no credit, and directed her to the church 2 streets over if she was in need of charity, and turned back to his inventory with the finality of a door closing. The church was locked. The saloon. She stood outside the saloon doors for a full minute and considered. The warmth was real. She could hear it from the street, the particular roar of a crowded room with a fire going, but she could also do the math on What walking into a mining town saloon alone, at nearly dark, bought a woman with no money and no one who knew her name, and the math did not come out in her favor. She found the deputy's office. He was inside, feet on the desk, hat over his face. She explained her situation, clearly, concisely. She was accustomed to being clear and concise. Edgar had not appreciated rambling. The deputy lifted the brim of his hat, looked at her. The assessment was familiar. Different version, same fundamental calculation. Then he set the hat back down over his face. "Road'll be clear in a few days," he said. "Keep warm." She stood there for 3 more seconds. He didn't say anything else. So the street, the cold. The mud that wasn't just coating her boots now, but had crept over the sole of her left shoe, where the leather had cracked somewhere, around the second relay station, and was now a living, creeping, intimate thing working its way up her ankle. Wren pressed her back against the rough wall of the assay office. The wood was wet, offered nothing in terms of warmth, just blocked the worst of the wind. She dug her fingernails into her palms. She was not going to cry, not because she was too proud. She'd gotten past pride somewhere around the stage depot at 4 in the morning. She was not going to cry because it wasted energy, and she could feel, with the precise accuracy of a body that had been running on fear and very little food for 3 days, that she had no energy left to waste. 2 days since Denver, 1 meal, hard biscuit and cold coffee at the second relay station. A stray dog trotted past in the sleet, ribs showing under a matted coat. It didn't even look at her. It knew better than to expect anything from a woman standing against a wall in Mom the Dark Smart Dog. Down the boardwalk, heavy footsteps. Even, unhurried, Wren's right hand found the letter opener in her coat pocket, wrapped around the cold brass handle. Her fingers were numb enough that she felt the grip more than held it. It was dull, completely useless as any kind of weapon against anything. But it was hers. The man came off the boardwalk and into the street. He was enormous. Not in the exaggerated way of a story, just in the plain, physical fact of a man who had spent decades doing work that built the body from the ground up. Wide shoulders, big hands, heavy buffalo coat with the fur worn down to cracked leather at the elbows. A slouch hat pulled low, brim collecting snow. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the battered buckboard wagon, hitched to 2 miserable-looking mules in front of the general store, and he was hauling a 50-pound sack of grain from the loading dock. He tossed it over the flour. He tossed it over the tailgate. It hit the wagon bed with a dead thud. One of the mules snorted, breath pluming white. Wren shivered. Not a polite shiver. A full-body seismic event that rattled her teeth and jerked her shoulders and was entirely beyond her control. The man stopped. He turned his head. Wren held her breath. Gripped the letter opener. He was perhaps 55, 60. Hard to tell under the beard and the weathering. His face was the face of a man who had spent a long time outdoors. Skin creased deeply at the corners of his eyes. Jaw set, the particular stillness of a person who moves slowly. Because he's learned, there's no benefit to hurrying. He looked at her the way you look at a thing you're trying to categorize. Not malicious, not kind. Just precise. He went back to the wagon, pulled a canvas tarp over the supplies, tied it down with hands that moved with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The rope rasped against the iron cleats. He checked the knot twice, then he looked at her again, at her shoes. The hem of her skirt, dark with frozen mud. "The shaking stores are closed," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel shifting at the bottom of a river. "I know," Wren said. Her voice came out thin. She hated that. She was used to her voice being a tool, clear and carrying and controlled. This voice belonged to someone smaller. He turned back to the front of the wagon, checked the mule's harnesses, ran a hand along the near trace. Finding the problem, then solving it. No wasted motion. You're going to freeze to death against that wall. "I'll manage," Wren said. She would not manage. He made a sound, not quite a laugh. Just a breath through his nose that acknowledged the lie and declined to argue with it. He walked around to the driver's side, panic. Cold and sharp, he was leaving. The last living soul on this street who had acknowledged her existence was leaving, and she, Wren Ashford, who had sat in Edgar Price's parlor for 4 months and smiled while she planned her escape, who had walked through Boston at 16 and told herself she would never be her mother, small and managed and grateful for what scraps of dignity she permitted, was going to die against the wall of an assay office in a town she'd never heard of, and no one would look for her. She took a step forward. Her boot tore free from the mud. A wet sucking sound. Wait. He stopped, one hand on the reins. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the mules. Then he turned. She made herself hold his gaze. "I don't have anywhere to go." She said it the way she said hard things, directly. Because hedging was for people who had options, the wind kicked up. It threw a fistful of ice crystals against her cheek. Stung. He looked at her for a long moment, the same precise assessment, taking in the ruined shoes, the thin wool, the shaking that was now continuous, and beyond any performance she might still be capable of. He let go of the reins, walked back to the tailgate, unlatched it, let it drop. The clatter of iron on iron echoed in the empty street. Come home and eat supper, not an invitation, not a question, not a rescue, a fact. The wagon bed smelled of raw canvas and axle grease, and the metallic cold of iron. Wren climbed in, or tried to. Her legs had less cooperation than she'd hoped. She grabbed the tailgate, got one knee up, and the man simply, without comment, without making anything of it, put one hand under her elbow and set her in the wagon the way you'd set a crate of eggs on a shelf. Efficient, not unkind. He tossed her a wool blanket from behind the seat. It smelled powerfully of wood smoke and old sweat, and the particular mustiness of something that had been stored in a cedar chest for a long time. She wrapped it around herself like it was the finest thing she'd ever worn. The man climbed onto the driver's bench, clicked his tongue at the mules, and they were moving. The road up the mountain was not a road. It was the idea of a road, the memory of a road. A suggestion that people had once moved through this terrain and might conceivably do so again, if they had no other choice and a wagon with no springs and 2 mules with opinions. Every rut transmitted directly through the wagon bed and then through Wren's spine. Every frozen rock, every gully carved by runoff and left to refreeze. She braced herself against the crate of what smelled like dried apples in the grain sack, and she fixed her eyes on the broad, immovable back of the man on the driver's bench. He sat straight, shoulders square, occasionally clicking his tongue or slapping the leather reins against the mules' backs. The snow was heavier now, fat flakes instead of sleet, and it was blanketing the trail and the trees and the darkness equally, she thought. He could stop the wagon anywhere on this mountain, she thought. Nobody in Coldwater Creek knows my name. She thought, if this ends badly, it will at least be warm somewhere first. And because her brain was running on fumes and cold, and the specific reckless clarity that comes from having no remaining options, she also thought, he had ample opportunity to do something terrible in the middle of town in front of an empty street, and he didn't. He tied down his canvas. He checked his harnesses. He went about his work like a man with chores to finish. Men who intend harm don't usually finish their chores first, probably. She pulled the blanket tighter. "Who are you?" she asked. The words came out small, snatched away immediately by the wind. A pause. Long enough that she thought he hadn't heard. "Mercer," he said. "Holt Mercer." "I'm Wren Ashford," he didn't reply. The mules kept walking. The snow kept falling. She had given her name to a stranger on a mountain, in a blizzard, with no money, no plan, and a dull brass letter opener in her pocket. It was the most honest thing she'd done in 4 months. The cabin appeared in the darkness the way most important things appear, without announcement, without ceremony, just suddenly there, when it hadn't been a moment before. Logs chinked with dried mud. Sharply pitched roof already carrying 6 inches of new snow. A stone chimney with a thin ribbon of smoke curling up into the black air. One window with the faintest warm glow behind it, Banked fire, not lamp, but enough. Holt pulled back on the reins. The mules stopped, with the immediate relief of animals who knew they were home. Wren tried to stand up. Her legs had been in one position for the better part of 2 hours in sub-freezing temperature, and they expressed their displeasure with complete clarity. They simply did not work. Her knees buckled the moment she put weight on them. She grabbed the side of the wagon and held on. Holt was already at the tailgate. He looked at her legs, looked up at her face. "Feet don't work," he said. Not a question, assessment. He reached up and wrapped both hands around her waist. His grip was entirely functional, no ceremony to it. The grip of a man moving something from one place to another, and lifted her out of the wagon and set her on the ground. Her legs gave out. He caught her by the arm before she hit the snow. "Right," he said, like this was additional information, and then he simply picked her up. One arm under her knees, the other at her back. She grabbed his neck without thinking, reflex, and he smelled of wet wool and pine pitch, and the faint copper of old blood on his left sleeve, and he carried her up three wooden steps to the porch and kicked the cabin door open with his boot like it was something he'd done before, with his hands full. The darkness inside was heavy, cold ash, old wood, stale tobacco. He deposited her in a high-backed wooden rocking chair, near the stone hearth, with the specific care of a man who was being careful not to drop something that required some care. And then he moved away and struck a match against the fireplace. The flame touched the moss and the pine twigs. Caught immediately. The smell of wood smoke, something in Wren's chest unknotted by exactly 1 degree. "Take your boots off." He set it over his shoulder, coaxing the fire with a long iron poker. Wren looked at her boots, the wet knots. Her fingers were not functioning in any useful way. They were the approximate temperature and usefulness of boiled carrots. She tried anyway. She got as far as identifying which string to pull, before Holt turned around, looked at her hands, walked over, and crouched in front of her. He swatted her hands away, not roughly, just out of the way. And then he worked the frozen knots with his fingers, in about 12 seconds flat, peeled back the cracked leather, and pulled her boots off with 2 efficient motions. Her stockings were soaked through. He pulled those off too. Wren looked at her own toes. The color wasn't right. Blue-white at the tips. She knew enough about cold to know what that meant, and the word frostbite formed in her mind with the cold precision of something that had been waiting to be thought. "Don't put them near the fire," Holt said, standing. He picked up her boots and set them near the door. "Not too close, not too far. They'll thaw too fast." "Hurts like," he paused. Recalibrated. "Hurts considerably." He walked to the table and lit the oil lamp. The light filled the cabin. Wren looked around. Single room. Not small, but no larger than it needed to be. Heavy cast iron stove in the corner, cold now. Shelves along the far wall lined with glass jars, preserved goods, mostly, pale shapes floating in dark liquid. Animal traps hanging from a rafter beam. A workbench with tools, arranged with what looked like compulsive neatness. A single narrow cot against the far wall under a heavy bear hide. One bed she swallowed. In the corner, partially obscured by a faded canvas curtain, hung on a sagging wire. A smaller space. She could see the edge of something. Furniture that was not a man's furniture. Lower to the ground. Smaller proportions. She didn't look long. Holt was already at the fireplace with an iron skillet. "Said you'd get supper," he muttered, not to her exactly. More to the general air of the cabin. "Ain't much. But it's hot." The sound of thick-cut salt pork hitting the hot iron was the loudest thing in the room. It hissed, popped, sent small sparks of grease into the flame. The smell hit Wren like a physical thing. Her stomach cramped so hard and so suddenly that she pressed her hand against her ribs. 3 days, near enough to 3 days, since anything real. The biscuit, the terrible coffee, snow. She watched him cook. He moved the way very experienced people move. No wasted steps, no checking whether the next thing was where he'd left it, because it was always where he'd left it. He halved an onion with a hunting knife. scraped the pieces into the rendering fat, added dried beans to a smaller pot. Set the pot on the edge of the coals. She watched his hands, scarred, calloused. The knuckles of the right hand had been broken at some point. You could see the slight misalignment healed in place. She looked for the tell she'd learned to look for. The glance at her legs, now visible below the hem of Holt's blanket. The lingering assessment. The small preparatory shift in body language that men didn't know they made, but always did. The recalculation of what was available. He looked at the skillet. She watched him look at the skillet for a solid 2 minutes. He added dried herbs from a small tin, stirred with a long iron fork, checked the beans, picked up the bread loaf, cut 2 thick slices, set them flat on the hot stone near the fire's edge to toast. That was all. Oh, she thought. And then didn't know what to do with the thought. He handed her the plate without ceremony. No, here you are, or careful it's hot. Just held it out. The tin was burning her palms. She didn't let go. She looked at the food. Heavy, greasy salt pork on charred bread with onion. Not a meal she would have looked at twice in another life. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She took a polite bite. 1 bite, that was all she managed of polite. The hot grease coated her tongue, salt and rich and entirely overwhelming. The bread was crisp on the outside and dense in the middle. The onion was barely cooked, still with some bite to it. The finishing schoolgirl, who had sat through 4-course dinners with silver on both sides of the plate and a different wine for each course. That girl went somewhere far away. What was left ate. She used her fingers. She used the bread to soak up the fat. She ate faster than she meant to, faster than was dignified, burning the roof of her mouth on a piece of pork and not slowing down even slightly. When the plate was clean, she ran her thumb around the rim and caught the last of the grease, and her chin was slick with it by the time she came back to herself. She looked up. Holt was watching her, his own plate, half-eaten, resting on one knee. He had those pale eyes. She hadn't gotten a good look at them in the street, but in the lamplight they were an odd color. Not quite gray, not quite green. The color of flint, chipped open. They weren't unkind, but they were very attentive. The heat started in her throat and moved upward. She lowered her gaze, wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. Discovered her chin was worse than she'd thought. I'm sorry, she stopped, hated herself for saying it reflexively. I was hungry, he said. She looked up. I know, he said. He looked back at his own plate and took another bite. Ain't a sin. The fire crackled. The wind threw snow against the window. Holt finished his supper. Wren sat with her empty plate in her lap, and the warmth from the food moving outward through her chest like a slow tide, and the exhaustion, 3 days of it, packed dense and waiting, settled over her all at once like the weight of that wool blanket. She looked at the cot, then at Holt. He stood up, set his plate on the table, walked to the cedar chest at the foot of the cot and opened it, pulled out a quilt, large, heavy, mismatched fabric squares, stitched together in no particular pattern, the kind made for warmth rather than beauty. He carried it over and dropped it in her lap. It knocked the breath out of her. Chair, he said. Or the floor near the hearth. Floor's harder, but it's warmer. She looked up at him. And you? My bed, he said, with the absolute placidity of a man stating that water runs downhill. He walked to the door, checked the iron bolt, walked to the lamp, and blew it out. The room dropped into darkness. Firelight only, orange and shifting. She heard him sit on the cot. The old rope springs complained. Movement. Stillness. And then, in the time it took her to unfold the quilt and wrap it around her shoulders, the sound of a man who had settled in and intended to stay that way, even breathing. Slow. Wren sat in the rocking chair. She listened to the wind. She listened to the fire. She listened to the breathing of this stranger, enormous and unknown, on the other side of the dark room. He hadn't asked for a thing. She'd been in his company for what? 3 hours. And he had fed her. He had carried her. He had crouched in front of her and unlaced her frozen boots without making her feel diminished by it. And he had turned his back and gone to sleep. The tear came without warning. Hot, fast. It slid down her cheek and cut through the grime and the dried sweat. And she felt it hit her chin, and she pulled the quilt up over her head and folded herself small in the wooden chair and cried, in the way she had not allowed herself to cry since she'd found those papers in Edgar's safe, silently, with her whole chest until there was nothing left, not from fear. From the terrible, overwhelming, entirely unexpected weight of one night being safe. She woke to gray light and the scraping sound of a whetstone on steel. Scrape, shh, scrape, shh. Her neck had lodged itself against the hard back of the rocking chair at an angle that guaranteed tomorrow's regret. Her feet were on fire. Not cold fire, but the hot needle fire of blood, returning to places it had abandoned. She remembered that. She remembered his warning. Hurts considerably. He'd been correct. She opened her eyes. Holt was at the table, back to her, working a whetstone over the curved blade of a hatchet in slow, deliberate circles. He had been awake long enough to restock the stove. The iron ticked with new heat, and a battered blue enamel pot sat on the warming plate, steam lifting from the spout. He didn't look up. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Grounds are thick. Don't let them surprise you." She tried to stand. Her feet offered a full and immediate accounting of the previous day's events. She made it to the stove by holding onto furniture, poured the coffee into a tin mug. It came out dark and dense, close to sludge, and she took a sip, and the bitterness hit first and then the heat, and it was extraordinary. She stood at the stove with the mug in both hands and let the steam warm her face. She could see things she'd missed the night before. The compulsive neatness of the tool arrangement on the workbench, the way the shelved jars were organized by size, the whetstone. Good quality, the kind kept, oiled and stored properly rather than left on a ledge, a man who cared how his tools were kept. And then the curtain. It moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. Canvas, faded, hung on a wire with wooden rings. She took 3 steps toward it without deciding to. She saw the edge of the cot from this angle, smaller, lower to the ground. The frame was plain pine, painted once a long time ago in a color that might have been blue. On the pillow a shape, small, soft, a stuffed bear worn nearly to shapelessness, button eyes, one ear held on by different colored thread. On the floor beside the cot, a pair of shoes, child's shoes, maybe a 4-year-old. Leather, buckle fastening. The buckles were tarnished now. The leather had dried and cracked with age, dust on everything. A long time. She turned. Holt was standing 2 feet behind her. She hadn't heard him move. He moved the way he did everything, without surplus, without announcement. He looked at what she'd seen. He looked at her. The stillness between them was not hostile. It was the stillness of 2 people who understood suddenly that something had been said without word, were deciding what to do about that. "Coffee," he said finally. He walked back to the table, sat down, picked up the whetstone, scrape. Shh. Wren held her mug. The little shoes sat in the dust where they'd always been. And outside, the mountain held its cold and its snow and its silence, and the smoke climbed from the chimney, in a thin, straight line into the pale Colorado sky. The blizzard arrived without warning, which was a lie, actually. It had been warning them for 2 days. The sky had been saying it. The mules had been saying it. They'd gone quiet and restless in the lean-to, pressing close to the wall, the way animals do when they know something is coming, and they want to be against something solid when it hits. Even the fire had been saying it. The way it pulled toward the chimney instead of breathing outward. The way the smoke came back down sometimes, curling into the room like it had changed its mind about leaving. Everything had been saying it. Wren just hadn't known how to listen yet. It hit on the 3rd morning. Not snow exactly. An assault, wind first, a sound like tearing fabric, like something enormous ripping open overhead. And then the white, sideways, horizontal, packing against the window glass until the glass disappeared entirely, behind a solid wall of white ice. The sky outside went the color of a bruise. The temperature inside the cabin dropped so fast Wren could feel it happen. One moment, bearable. The next, Her breath was visible. The mud chinking between the logs found every crack it had been quietly failing to fill, and let the cold through in thin, blade-like streams that moved across the room in ways she could feel on her ankles and the back of her neck. The cabin shrank. That was how it felt, not smaller in any measurable way. But the walls came in. The ceiling pressed down. The single room that had felt spare but sufficient became, over the course of an hour, a wooden box the size of a coffin, 2 steps from the hearth to the table. 2 steps back, Wren counted. 14 times before she caught herself counting. Holt appeared to have no feelings about any of this. He was on the floor near the stove, with a broken leather harness across his knees, an awl in one hand and heavy waxed thread in the other. He'd been at it since just after breakfast, pulling the thick thread through the punched holes with slow, mechanical authority. The muscle in his jaw moved in rhythm with each pull. Not tension, just work. He hadn't spoken in 2 hours. 2 hours. Wren paced. The floorboards creaked. She paced the other direction. They creaked differently. She had tried reading. There were 3 books on the shelf, a surveying manual, a Bible with the spine wrapped in a strip of worn leather, stitched down by hand, and something called the Revised Statutes of Colorado Territory, 1868. She had opened all 3. She had closed all 3. She had tried organizing the shelf of preserved jars. Holt had looked up once, briefly, and she had put the jars back. She had tried to recall, in order, every piece of music she had ever learned on the piano. She got through 12 before she realized she was doing it out loud, quietly under her breath, and the absolute silence from the floor was somehow louder than if Holt had said something. "Do you ever talk?" she said. The words came out before she could stop them, sharp, a little desperate. Holt punched the awl through the leather. "Talk when there's something worth saying, and nothing is worth saying. Not currently." She let out a sound. Half laugh. Half something else entirely. "We are," she said, "trapped in a wooden box while the world ends outside. And you are sitting there repairing a horse harness like it is a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. In July." He pulled the thread through. "It's Wednesday." "That is not the point." "What's the point?" "The point is..." She stopped, pressed both hands against her face, breathed, let them drop. "I am going to lose my mind in here. I can feel it happening. It's like watching a wall crack." Holt set the harness on his knee. He looked up at her, not with irritation, not with sympathy exactly, with that precise, assessing quality that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked as he was trying to understand. "Yesterday, you were fixing to freeze to death against a wall," he said. "Today you're warm enough to complain about the quiet." A pause. "That's not losing your mind. That's improvement." The blunt truth of it hit her like a hand to the sternum. The fight went out of her all at once. Not gradually, all at once. Like a lamp blown out, she swayed slightly. The sudden drop in heat, in adrenaline, in whatever had been holding her upright. Holt watched her sway. He sighed. The same heavy, inconvenient sound he'd made when her legs gave out in the snow. He set the harness on the floor, stood up with the unhurried ease of a large man who had stopped hurrying about things a long time ago. Walked to the cedar chest at the foot of the cot, opened it, rummaged inside with one hand, pulled out a flannel shirt, faded red. Washed so many times the color had gone soft. It smelled, even from across the room, of lye soap and cedar and thyme. He threw it at her. She caught it against her chest. "Take the wet dress off," he said, turning his back to her and walking to the stove. He picked up the iron poker and started working at the coals. "Hang it near the fire. Not too close or it'll singe." Wren looked at the shirt. Looked at his back. "You want me to?" "Damp kills in this air." He jabbed at a coal. "Ain't looking at you." She turned toward the dark corner. "Do it fast. Don't think about it. Don't think about." She fumbled with the buttons, small, stiff. Her fingers still not fully cooperative in the cold. The fabric was rigid with dried mud and dried sweat, and 3 days of running and fear, and it took far longer than it should have to work each button free. Every time the wind hit the cabin. Every time the fire shifted. Every time Holt moved near the stove, her breath caught. She peeled the dress from her shoulders. It fell to the floor in a wet heap. She was left in her cotton chemise and petticoats, equally damp, equally inadequate. She set the brass letter opener on the shelf by the door, looked at it a moment, dull, slightly ridiculous, entirely useless as anything except what it was, hers. She turned away. She pulled Holt's flannel shirt over her head. As fast as her clumsy hands could manage, it swallowed her, hem hitting just above her knees, sleeves hanging past her fingertips. The fabric was rough against her skin and dense, and warm, actually warm. The warmth of something that had been lived in. The warmth of something that held its heat the way good thick wool holds it, because it had been washed 100 times and never once lost its substance. She rolled the sleeves up to her wrists, picked up her ruined dress, and draped it over the back of the rocking chair, pulling it toward the fire. When she turned around, Holt was looking at her, not at her bare legs below the shirt hem, not at the thin cotton petticoat, at her face, only her face, with those flint-chipped eyes that missed very little. "Better," he said. Wren pulled the collar tighter around her throat. "Yes," she said quietly. "Thank you." She meant the shirt. She might have meant several other things as well. Holt gave a short, single nod, picked up the harness, sat back down on the floor, went back to the thread and the awl. The silence returned, but this time it had no teeth. By the second day of the storm, Wren had decided that doing nothing was a kind of death all its own. She was not built for nothing. She had run a household at 23 when her father's health first started to fail. She had managed staff and accounts and the social calendar of a man who would not admit he was declining. She had done it quietly, efficiently, without acknowledgement, because that was the nature of that particular work, invisible until it wasn't done. She could be useful here. She was certain of it. She started with the stove. The cast-iron skillet from the previous night sat on the warming plate with a thin film of congealed fat. She had watched Holt cook twice now. She understood, in theory, how a cast-iron stove worked. Feed the fire, manage the heat through the damper, keep the flat surface above the coals at the right temperature. Simple enough. She picked up the heavy skillet by the handle, iron. Cold seasoned. 30 years of use pressed into the metal. Her fingers, still not fully cooperative, still missing their usual dexterity. Slipped, the skillet hit the floor. The sound was extraordinary. A single concussive bang that ricocheted off the log walls and the stone hearth and the low ceiling and seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. And then the long metallic ring of iron vibrating against floorboards. Wren jumped back. Her shoulder hit the shelf. A jar rattled, and then she folded, not all the way to the floor. But her shoulders came in. Her chin dropped. She took one fast step backward until her back was against the shelf, and her hands came up in front of her, not high, just up, just between herself and whatever was coming, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Waited, here it comes. Whatever it is, here it comes. The silence after the crash was enormous. Then footsteps, measured, not fast, not angry, just moving toward her. She made herself open her eyes. Holt crouched in front of the skillet. He looked at it, looked at her. He took in the folded shoulders, the hands in front of her, the back pressed hard against the shelf. He didn't say anything immediately. He reached down and picked up the skillet, set it on the warming plate, straightened. "Your hands are still cold," he said. "Grab cold iron like that, you'll slip every time." He looked at her hands. "Sit down." She didn't move. Her heart was still trying to exit her chest through her sternum. "I was just trying to—" "I know. I dropped it. I didn't mean to." "I know. Not sharp, not impatient. Just certain. Sit down." He picked up a cloth from the hook by the stove, went to work on the skillet himself. Wren walked to the rocking chair. Sat, her hands were shaking. Not from cold. She stared at them. "When did you learn to do that?" she thought. "When did your body learn to fold before anything had even happened?" She knew exactly when. She knew the specific evening, the specific shift in the atmosphere of Edgar's study, the specific quality of silence that preceded the first time he hadn't hit her. Not quite. He'd taken hold of her arm so tightly that the bruise lasted 11 days, and he'd spoken quietly about the importance of discretion. And by the time he was finished, she'd understood that the pain was the punctuation, not the sentence. And after that, she'd learned to fold, preemptively, like an apology made before the accusation. She looked at Holt's back. He was cleaning the skillet with the focused attention of someone who had decided the skillet needed to be clean and was making it so. "I thought you were going to," she started. "I know what you thought," he said. Quiet. Still focused on the skillet. "I'm sorry." He stopped, set the skillet down, turned. "Don't apologize for that," he said. Something in his voice had changed. Still low, still even, but a different quality underneath it, like rock underwater. "Harder than what was visible. That isn't your fault," he said. "That's somebody else's doing." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She asked him to teach her to feed the stove the next morning, early, before he'd picked up the harness again. She asked him directly, without preamble, because she had learned that Holt Mercer responded to directness better than any other approach. He looked at her over his coffee mug. "You sure? I learn by doing. You'll burn yourself." "Probably," she said. "I'll learn from that too." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. The way a cloud shifts to let light through without fully moving, that fractional shift that was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. He walked her through it, damper positions. How the iron rings on the stovetop came out to expose the fire directly for boiling versus sitting higher for a slower, even heat. How to judge the coal bed by color. Red, orange good, white ash too low. Add more wood. How to set the wood so the air could move through it. How to close the draft when the heat was right and not before. He used about 40 words total. She asked 3 questions. Each one he answered in 1 sentence. It was, she thought, the most efficient teaching she had ever received. More was said in the quality of his silence than in most of the lectures she'd sat through in Boston. She burned herself twice. He handed her a strip of clean cloth from the shelf without comment. They developed a rhythm. It wasn't announced. It wasn't negotiated. It simply emerged, the way patterns emerge between people who share a small space long enough. Organic, wordless, built from mutual observation. He cooked the meat. She managed the stove and the beans. He handled anything requiring the heavy iron tools. She took over the washing up, now that her hands had remembered how to grip. He brought in wood at dawn and dusk. She kept the fire between. She stopped asking permission. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. The 3rd day of the blizzard, Wren woke in the early dark to the sound of wind that had gone from howling to something quieter and more terrifying. A sustained roar, not gusting, constant. Like the storm had stopped performing and settled in to mean it. She was shivering before she was fully conscious. The fire had burned down to embers. Not out. Holt kept it from going fully out. Fed it at intervals through the night, but low enough that the cabin had cooled significantly. She pushed herself up from the rocking chair. Wrong. Her legs were weak. Her head swam. The shivering was not the ordinary shivering of cold. It was the deeper, bone-deep, involuntary kind that came from somewhere lower than muscle. No, not now. She made it to the stove. Put her hand on the iron for balance. The iron was warm, but not enough. She poured coffee, or tried to. Her hand wasn't cooperating properly. The spout hit the rim of the mug at the wrong angle, and she had to use both hands to correct it. Both hands, shaking. She held the mug, drank. The bitterness hit first. Then the heat. Then, nothing changed. That was wrong. The heat of coffee should have cut through the chill, should have sent a trail of warmth downward. Instead, it was just hot on her tongue and nothing else, because the cold wasn't in her mouth. The cold was in her blood. She made it back to the rocking chair, sat down, a tickle in the back of her throat. She swallowed hard. Tried to contain it. It didn't contain. The cough came out of nowhere. A harsh, rattling sound that tore through the cabin like a branch snapping. and then another, and she doubled forward with the force of it, hand over her mouth, eyes watering. Don't, not now. Not in front of. Hey, Holt's voice. From the cot, he'd been asleep, or she'd thought he was. She waved a hand in the universal gesture of I'm fine, don't concern yourself. She coughed again. It was not the gesture of someone who was fine. The rope, springs on the cot, protested, footsteps on the cold floor. And then Holt was crouching in front of her, just like with the skillet, same posture, same particular quality of attention. And he reached out and pressed that hand against her forehead. His skin was rough. Smelled of sleep and old leather. It felt shockingly cold against her face, or her face was shockingly hot. One of those. He held his hand there for a moment. Took it away. Fever, he said. I'm fine, she said. Her voice came out like something scraped off the bottom of a boot. He stood up, walked to the shelf, took down a small glass jar, dried bark, stripped in long, pale curls. He shook a pinch of it into a tin cup, poured boiling water from the kettle. The steam rose dark and medicinal. Get in the bed, he said. I absolutely will not take your. Get in the bed, Wren. Not loud. Not angry. Just the weight of a man who had decided how this was going and was informing her of that decision. Holt, you die in that rocking chair. I have to dig a hole in frozen ground. Ground is like iron right now. He picked up the tin cup, walked toward her. I ain't doing it. She stared at him. He looked back, patient. Absolute. That is the least sentimental argument for keeping me alive I have ever heard, she said. Did it work? A pause. Yes, she said. He helped her to the cot. She could walk. Just not efficiently. Her legs were making their own decisions, slightly delayed from the decisions she was making, which was a disturbing quality in legs. Holt kept a hand at her elbow, not holding her up entirely, just there. A correction when the floor seemed to tilt. He pulled the bare hide up to her shoulders. She'd been curious about that hide since the first night. Up close, it smelled of must and old fur, and something underneath that was just animal, completely. It was incredibly heavy. The weight of it alone seemed to press the shivering down. Drink, he said, holding the tin cup. She took a sip. The taste hit her like a bad decision. Bitter didn't cover it. Bitter was a flavor. This was a punishment. Ancient and medicinal and deeply, profoundly unpleasant. Like chewing the bark of something that had never wanted to be chewed. What is that? She gasped. Willow bark. It tastes like. It'll bring the fever down. He held the cup steady. All of it. She drank all of it. Every foul, astringent, deeply unfair drop. He set the cup on the floor. Duds, stay under the hide, he said. Don't kick it off. I won't kick it. He was already at the door, pulling on his buffalo coat. She heard the bolt. The roar of the storm as the door opened. Whined that hit from 10 feet away. And then the door closed and the bolt slid home and she was alone. She lay in the narrow cot. It was harder than the rocking chair and warmer than anything she'd experienced in days. The bear hide was heavy enough to be its own source of gravity. The smell of it, old and wild and somehow entirely safe, was the last thing she was aware of before the willow bark and the fever pulled her under. She didn't dream so much as remember. The memories came in the disordered way they come in fever. Not sequential, not logical, just arriving in full sensory detail without context or warning. Edgar's study, the smell of his tobacco. The particular way candlelight hit the brass fittings of the safe when it was open. Her own hands folding the documents. Too calm. Terrifyingly calm. The stage depot at 4 in the morning. The ticket agent who looked at her and looked away, already absenting himself from whatever situation she was in. Mrs. Caldwell, her kind face, the basket smelling of cinnamon, the slight, practiced warmth of a woman performing warmth, the mud in Coldwater Creek. The way it had a voice, a wet sucking sound with every step, like the ground itself was reluctant to let her go. And then, darker, Edgar's hand. Not his whole hand at first in the memory, just a detail. The gold ring on his fourth finger, the way it caught light. And then the memory expanded and there was the ring, and the hand it was on, and she was in his study again, on a Thursday evening, in September, and she had just told him that she had found the contracts, and she had seen them, and she knew what they meant, which she hadn't said any of that. She'd said something careful and indirect, something meant to test without exposing herself. But he'd understood anyway. He always understood Ren. Just her name. Quiet. Pleasant. The way you say the name of a child you're about to correct. She had stayed very still. His hand moved and then pressure at her throat. His thumb below one side of her jaw and his fingers below the other, not squeezing. Not exactly, just present, just there in the way that made it clear what he could do and was simply, at this moment, choosing not to. Discretion, he said, is the quality I prize most in the people around me. He held her there for perhaps 4 seconds, then let go, straightened his cuffs. Went back to his brandy. She came up from the fever like coming up from water, thrashing. Her arms found the edge of the cot and she grabbed it, gasping, and the bare hide was tangled around her legs, and everything was dark except the orange pulse of banked coals, hands on her wrists. Firm, not restraining. Just, stop the motion, easy, Holt said. She'd blinked. He was there, sitting on a wooden crate beside the cot. He had not gone to bed. She didn't know when she'd last known what time it was, or how long the fever had held her under. But Holt was sitting beside her in the firelight, with a bowl of melted snow in his lap and a damp cloth in his hand, and his eyes were doing the thing they always did. Taking stock, assessing, finding the problem. You with me? He said. Yes, she said. She wasn't completely sure, but she said yes. He dipped the cloth in the icy water, wrung it, pressed it to her forehead, cold, shockingly cold. She leaned into it. He moved the cloth to her cheek, her jaw, the side of her neck. He stopped. The stillness hit her even through the fever haze. One moment he was moving, methodical, efficient, and then he was not moving. The cloth was in his hand. His hand was in the air, and the room had gone quieter than it already was. She realized her collar had slipped. She knew because the air hit the skin below her throat, the bruised skin. She had left Denver 22 days ago. She knew because she had been counting, the way you count the days of something you are trying to survive. The skin that was still, 3 weeks after the fact, carrying the yellow and purple signature of Edgar's hand, fingers and thumb. Unmistakable. Panic. She reached for the hide with both hands, yanked it up to her chin. Holt didn't move for a long moment. He looked at the place where the bruises had been. Then he looked at the wall. His jaw had gone tight, not in anger, not the expressive anger of a man performing feelings, but the deep muscular tightening of a man pressing something down very hard so it stays contained. The silence stretched heavy, airless. He lowered his hand, dipped the cloth back into the water. Fever's breaking, he said. His voice was even. Low, stripped of everything except the fact of it. Go back to sleep. He folded the cloth, laid it carefully across her forehead, and then he sat back. She heard him settle on the crate. Heard the specific quality of a man making himself still, for the long kind of sitting, the kind that expects to last all night. She didn't look. She kept her eyes closed and the hide pulled to her chin, and her breathing deliberately slow, but she was aware of him. The way you're aware of a heat source in a dark room, the warmth of him, sitting there. The slight sounds of a man awake and watchful. The particular silence of someone who has decided they are not leaving. She fell asleep, for the first time since Denver. The deep kind, the kind without dreams. The silence woke her, a vast hollow, ringing quiet that her ears couldn't interpret because they had been calibrated for wind. The storm had been the constant for so long that its absence was louder than it had been. She opened her eyes. The cabin was flooded with white light, not the orange gold of fire. White, brilliant and specific, mountain morning after snowfall light. The kind that doesn't apologize for being exact. She lay still for a moment and took an inventory. Cool skin where there had been burning skin. Damp at the collar of Holt's flannel shirt, dried sweat. Headache pressing at her temples. Mouth dry and stale, with the residual bitterness of willow bark. But the fire was gone. The heat that had been eating her from the inside. Gone. She turned her head. Holt was at the stove, back to her, the smell of coffee and rendering fat in the air. He was scraping the skillet with a metal spatula in short, controlled strokes. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her arms shook. They obeyed, though, which was something. The storm, she said, or tried to. It came out like a question shaped from gravel. Holt glanced over his shoulder, just his head. One quick look, like he'd been waiting for that sound, blew itself out an hour before dawn. He turned back to the stove, plated whatever was in the skillet, walked to the cot, handed her the tin plate. Bacon. 2 pieces of fried bread, hot enough to steam. She took it. He went and got his own plate, sat on the wooden stump by the hearth, ate. The morning light fell across the deep lines around his eyes, the gray in his beard, the specific exhaustion of a man who had not slept. She looked at him for a moment. He had stayed all night. She had known that, half conscious in the fever dark, but knowing it fully, in the clear morning light, was a different thing. She picked up a piece of bacon. Her hand was steadier than expected. She ate it. Then the next piece, slowly, deliberately. Her stomach, shrunk and careful after days of disruption, accepted it. She set the plate on the floor beside the cot. The bare hide was heavy across her lap. His name was Edgar, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. The words simply arrived fully formed and left her mouth before she could decide whether to let them. Holt stopped eating. He didn't look up, didn't ask, he said. I know. She looked at her hands in her lap, pale, still slightly swollen at the knuckle where she'd burned herself on the stove. But you saw. A pause. Holt set his plate down on the floor between his boots. He rested his forearms on his knees, laced his thick, scarred fingers together, looked at the stove door. She told him, not everything, not all at once. In the careful, factual way of a woman who had been precise about language for a very long time, because imprecision had consequences. Her father's debt, the estate, Edgar's arrival in his black lacquer coach, the ring, the performance she'd told herself she could paint, the evenings in the parlor, where something was always slightly wrong, but she couldn't identify what until it was too late to leave. And then the specific evening, the study, the safe, the documents with the wrong signatures, and then his hand. She touched her throat. Not dramatically. Just. Her fingers went there the way they did sometimes automatically. Holt watched her hand. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. He reached into his shirt pocket, took out a small tin of tobacco, rolled a cigarette with slow, methodical precision, the paper, the tobacco, the seal, and struck a match against the hearthstone, touched it to the end, drew once, exhaled toward the ceiling. A man who does that to a woman, he said, isn't proving he's strong. The smoke drifted. He's proving he's afraid of her, of what she sees in him. Another draw. Frightened animal trying to prove it has teeth. He looked at the stove. Is he looking for you? She felt the cold spike of it, in her gut. Right where it always lived. He has money, she said. He has people. Is he looking? Yes. Holt turned the cigarette in his fingers. Past stays snowed in till April, he said. Flat. Absolute. The tone of a man stating the weight-bearing capacity of a bridge he built himself. Nobody tracks anything through 10 feet of drift. If he sends men when the snow clears, they've got to come up the canyon. He looked at her. Ain't no other way up. She waited. Ain't no one coming up that canyon, he said, unless I say so. No flourish, no vow. No dramatic lean forward with his eyes locked on hers. Just geography. And a man who knew the terrain. She swallowed the thing rising in her throat. Why are you doing this? She said. You don't know me. I showed up in the mud. You owe me nothing. He was quiet. I dropped your skillet, she added. Because apparently that was where her mind went when she was overwhelmed. His jaw loosened by a fraction. On another man, it would have meant nothing. On Holt, it meant something. You survived 2 days in that mud, he said, with a dull letter opener. In your coat pocket, he stood up, picked up both plates from the floor, set them on the table. You ain't useless. You're just running the wrong trade. He walked to the door. Started pulling on his coat. Mules need checking, he said. They'll be half buried. He stopped just for a moment. His back still to her. Hand on the door bolt. Stay under the hide a while longer, he said. Not an order. Something else. Something that lived just below an order, in the tone of a person who would like something but will not require it. I will, she said. He nodded. Opened the door. The light was blinding, white and total. The reflected glare of a world freshly covered, and then the door closed, and the bolt slid home, and she was alone. Annan in the cabin with the clear, quiet morning and the faint smell of his tobacco still in the air. 2 days later, Wren found the drawer. She hadn't been looking for anything. She was cleaning the table, something she'd taken to doing with the methodical thoroughness of a person who needed to do at least one thing well per day. And the bottom drawer of the table had a loose front panel that rattled when she moved the rag across it. She'd been meaning to mention it to Holt. Instead, she opened it, not snooping. The drawer just opened inside. A clean cloth, a small bottle of gun oil, a length of leather cord, and underneath the cloth, wrapped in a square of brown canvas, she set the rag down. She picked it up, anyway. Unwrapped the canvas, a badge not large, heavy for its size, solid silver, which had gone dark with age, and something that might have been deliberate neglect. The shape of a star with a circle around it. Engraved in the center, Deputy United States Marshal. She turned it over. The back was scratched, not from where. From something sharp and intentional. The lines, too regular, too purposeful, to be accidental. Scratched repeatedly over the same surface. The way you scratch something you want to deface without destroying. Like someone who couldn't throw it away but couldn't look at it as it was. Under the badge, a photograph. Small. Mounted on cardstock the way photographs were done in studios. Stiff backing, slightly sepia at the edges from age. She held it toward the light from the window, a man. Younger, perhaps 35, different in every way she would not have predicted. Not the fractional, almost nothing she'd seen once or twice in the last week, but actually smiling, the kind that put lines at the corners of both eyes and changed the whole architecture of a face. She stared at that smile for a moment, filed it away. For later, beside him, a woman. Dark hair, slight build, her head resting against his shoulder in the easy, unself-conscious way of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Ruth. She didn't know how she knew. She just knew. And sitting on his knee, a child. Young, perhaps 5. Dark-haired like the woman. The child was not smiling in the photograph, but looking at something to the left with the absolute focused attention of small children and no one else. Small shoes buckled at the ankle. She recognized the shape of those shoes. She wrapped the badge and the photograph back in the canvas, set them in the drawer, closed it. She stood at the table for a moment. 8 years, she thought. 8 years in this cabin, with that drawer closed. She picked up her rag. She finished cleaning the table. Holt came back in at dusk with 2 rabbits and more firewood than she'd expected anyone to carry at once. He set the wood by the stove, hung the rabbits on the hook by the door, pulled off his coat, and then stopped. He looked at her, not the assessment. Something else. A quality in her face, probably. She was not good at hiding things she'd been thinking about for hours. She met his eyes. I wasn't looking, she said. The drawer was loose. He was still for a moment. Then he walked to the table, sat down heavily, rested both forearms on the wood. Looked at the grain of the table. I know, he said, and then something shifted. Yeah, she'd watched him for 8 days now. She knew the set of his shoulders when he was working and when he was at rest and when he was thinking about something he didn't intend to discuss. She knew the difference between his silences. This one was different from all of them. Colorado, he said. 1872. He didn't look up. I was working a case for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, hired on as deputy marshal, assigned to the railroad claim for the season. A pause. 4 months. She didn't say anything. Ruth was alone with Billy. We had a neighbor, man everyone liked, respectable. The kind of man who gets invited to things and nobody wonders why. His thumb moved along the edge of the table, back and forth. Once. He started coming around while I was gone. The fire shifted, settled. By the time I got home, Ruth didn't. He stopped. Started again differently. She was still there. Still in the house. But she wasn't the same person I'd left, and she couldn't tell me why. Couldn't say it, but I could see it. I knew what it looked like. His jaw tightened. I'd seen it before. In other people's houses. Part of the work, he was quiet. I tried to go through proper channels, he said, and the particular flatness with which he said it communicated everything about how that had gone. Man had lawyers, had friends, had a reputation built over 20 years. He picked up the badge from the drawer. She hadn't heard him open it, but it was in his hand and she understood that he'd known it had been touched. Law didn't protect her the way it should have. He set the badge on the table, didn't look at it. She didn't make it through that winter. The fire, the wind outside, lighter now. Post-storm. Billy went the following summer. He said it the same way he said other facts. Factually. But his thumb had stopped moving. Typhoid fever. Wren looked at his hands. I took off the badge, he said. And I came up here. And you've stayed. And I stayed. She wanted to say something. She turned over several options. All of them felt inadequate in the particular way that true things sometimes feel inadequate, next to the sheer weight of what they're responding to. You tracked outlaws across 3 states, she said finally, and you couldn't track the thing that was right next door. He looked at her. I couldn't, he said. That isn't. She stopped, chose the words. That isn't failure of ability. You weren't there. You couldn't have known. I should have known. How? He didn't answer. How? She said again. Not challenging, genuinely, asking. The silence this time was not the heavy, oppressive kind. It was the kind that happens when a question is real and has no good answer and the person being asked knows it. He looked at the badge on the table. She reached out, put her hand over it. Not to take it, just to cover it. Ruth would have told you, she said quietly, to stop punishing yourself. His breath caught. It was the smallest sound. Almost nothing. But in the quiet of that cabin, in that specific moment, it was everything. He didn't speak. She left her hand where it was for a moment, then pulled it back. I'll clean the rabbits, she said. If you tell me how. He blinked. Looked at her. Whatever had been on his face in that moment was going back behind the careful, habitual quiet. But not all the way. Some of it stayed. You don't need to. I want to learn. She pushed her chair back. Show me. He looked at her. For a long moment. Then he got up. They cleaned the rabbits, together in the lamplight, while outside the last of the storm's clouds broke apart overhead. And the first stars in a week came out, cold and sharp and clear above the Colorado mountains. And the smoke from the cabin chimneys, straight up in chimney, rose straight up into the dark for the first time since the blizzard started. Straight up. No wind to take it sideways, just up. The thaw came slowly, the way good things often do, not all at once, not dramatically. Just a drip from the eve at noon, then 2 drips, then a thin, tentative trickle down the south-facing wall of the cabin that stopped when the sun went behind a cloud and started again when it came back. The snow on the roof shifted in the night with a sound like something exhaling. The creek behind the tree line, which had been silent under ice for weeks, began to make a low, underwater murmuring that Wren could hear in the early mornings if she stood still and paid attention. The mountain was waking up. And with it, the road, 3 days after the storm broke. Wren could see the trail, not all of it, not the canyon section, which was still deep with drifted snow. But the clearing around the cabin had dropped from knee-deep to ankle-deep, and the dark line of the wagon track was visible beneath the remaining white, a suggestion, a beginning. She stood at the window and looked at it, and felt something complicated. Of course you do, she told herself. You're sensible. You know what a visible road means. What a visible road meant was, the world still existed. It had been waiting. Denver was still down there. Edgar Price was still down there. Mrs. Caldwell and her basket of cinnamon and her careful warmth were still down there. The letter Wren had written in her head 100 times to a solicitor in Boston. The letter that would begin the process of doing something about forged signatures and fraudulent land contracts. That letter still needed to get written and sent and answered. Life was down there, her life. The one she'd have to build from the pieces of the old one. She knew all of this, except there was also this specific window, in this specific cabin, with the pine smoke and the coffee that tasted like burned bark and was somehow the best thing she'd ever drunk. There was the rhythm of two people in a small space who had stopped bumping into each other. There was the corner of Holt's mouth, the almost smile she'd learned to watch for. The way he'd started leaving the coffee cup on the shelf, closest to the stove, because he'd noticed, without being asked, that her hands were steadier when the cup wasn't too heavy to lift. Small thing, enormous thing. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. Don't make it into something it isn't, she told herself. He took in a stray. The storm is over. Strays go. She turned away from the window. Holt was up before her. This was not unusual. She suspected he'd been waking before dawn his entire adult life and had simply stopped questioning it. But this morning was different. She came out of the back of the cabin. She'd taken to sleeping on the child's cot behind the curtain, which Holt had allowed without comment, and which she understood was a significant thing he was allowing without comment. And she found him down at the table with the harness, or the whetstone or the rifle. He was at the door, coat on, hat in hand, and through the open crack of the door she could hear a sound. Harness, the specific jingle and creak of a wagon being rigged. Her stomach dropped. Oh, he's hitching the mules. She stood in the middle of the room and did the math. 3 days of thaw, the canyon track rough but passable for a buckboard. Coldwater Creek by nightfall. Stage through at noon tomorrow. The math was very simple, and the answer was time. He heard her. He always heard her. She'd stopped being surprised by it. He turned, hat still in hand, and the look on his face was the thing she'd come to recognize as Holt Mercer's version of uncertainty, which was not what uncertainty looked like on most people. On most people, uncertainty was visible, a shift in the eyes, a change in posture. On Holt, it was a quality of stillness that was slightly different from his other stillnesses. Harder to define, harder to look at. Roads clear enough, he said. I see that. Mules are fit. Snow's off the canyon section mostly. He turned the hat in his hands. Once. Make Coldwater Creek by nightfall. A say man there owes me a favor. You could sleep indoors. A pause. Stage comes through at noon tomorrow. Wren looked at the hat rotating in his hands. She had never seen him fidget before. Interesting. I don't have money for the stage, she said. I'll see to it. Holt? Call it repayment, he said. For the skillet work. She almost laughed. The laugh came up her throat, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The skillet work, she repeated. You've gotten better. I've only burned myself twice this week. Improvement. She looked at him. He looked at his hat. The silence between them had a particular quality this morning, different from all the other silences. And she had catalogued them all at this point, all their specific weights and textures. The working silence, the eating silence, the night silence, the silence after she'd said something difficult, and he was deciding what to say back. This one was new. This one was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something, and both looking at it, and neither one willing to be the first to name what it is. I'll pack my things, she said, because one of them had to. She didn't have much to pack. This was the practical reality of having fled Denver in the dark, with one trunk and no money, and then lost the trunk somewhere in the chaos of Coldwater Creek. What she had, her ruined navy wool dress, now dry and demudded but structurally compromised, and smelling faintly of something that would never fully wash out. Her boots, resoled with a strip of leather Holt had cut from a scrap piece without being asked, about 2 days after the fever broke. The oilcloth packet with Edgar's contracts, which she had kept on her person at all times, including through the fever, held against her ribs, in a way that had left a rectangular impression in the skin of her side. The brass letter opener. That was everything. She folded the navy dress, set it in the carpet bag, looked at Holt's flannel shirt, which she was currently wearing over her chemise, because her dress was in the bag, right? She was going to have to put the dress back on. She reached for the buttons at the collar of the flannel shirt, and then she stopped. Just for a second, she pressed both hands flat against the front of it. It smelled like wood smoke, like cedar, like the inside of this cabin that smelled like nothing she could name exactly, but that she was discovering, remember for the rest of her life. Just don't. She unbuttoned the shirt, set it on the end of the cot, pulled the dress on over her chemise. It was cold and stiff and immediately uncomfortable in the way of a thing that no longer quite fit. Not physically, but in some other sense she couldn't articulate. She buttoned the dress, picked up the carpet bag, walked out. Holt had the buckboard ready. Both mules, thinner than they'd been a month ago but sturdy, and plainly relieved to be moving. The wagon bed swept clean. A folded blanket on the seat beside the driver's bench. For her, she looked at it. He'd thought of that. A folded blanket on the passenger side so she wouldn't be cold on the way down. Stop it, she told herself. A blanket is a blanket. He'd do it for anyone. He'd probably do it for the mules if mules sat on bench seats. She put her carpet bag in the back. Holt was checking the near mule's left front shoe. Something he did every time before moving. She'd noticed always the same sequence. Left front, left rear, right rear. He didn't skip it because they were in a hurry. He didn't skip it because other things were on his mind. She had never seen him skip a step. Holt, she said. He finished checking the last shoe. Straightened. Turned. She hadn't planned what came next. Which was the problem. She was very good at planning. She'd planned her escape from Denver, down to which drawer the cash was in, and which route would take her away from the most watch roads. She planned her words before she said them, usually. She planned her expressions. She had been planning herself carefully and thoroughly, since she was old enough to understand that unplanned women in her world tended to get managed by other people's plans. But standing in the mud of this clearing in the February mountain morning, with the mules breathing steam and the distant creek running under ice and the smoke from the cabin chimney curling up into the cold blue sky behind Holt Mercer's shoulder, she had nothing. Thank you, she said, which was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate while she was saying it. For the food, she said, the medicine, the all of it. She gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the general region of the last 3 weeks. Holt looked at her. She had an uneasy feeling he could see the inadequacy as clearly as she could. How much do I owe you? She said. For the food and the supplies. I'll send payment when You don't owe me anything, he said. I do, actually. I'm not a charity case, Ren. She stopped. You don't owe me anything, he said again. Same tone. Not shutting her down. Just certain. She pressed her lips together. Right, she said. Well, she picked up the corner of her dress to climb onto the wagon, and the mud grabbed her boot, and she yanked it free, and it made that sound, the wet sucking sound, the exact same sound as that night in Coldwater Creek. And something about that particular sound, that specific sensory memory, made her stop completely. She stood in the mud the last time you heard that sound. She thought. You were about to die against a wall. And then he said, come home and eat supper. She set her foot back down, in the mud, both feet. Flat. She turned around. Holt was still standing where he'd been. He hadn't moved to help her into the wagon. He was just there, hat on, coat on. Completely still, in the way he was still, which was not the stillness of a man waiting, but the stillness of a man who has made his peace with whatever comes next. You were going to let me go, she said. It's your choice, he said. You weren't going to say anything. I said what I had to say. Which was that the stage comes through at noon. She looked at him. He looked back. The mules shifted. One of them made the specific sound of a mule who has opinions about standing in cold mud and would prefer if decisions were made. Holt Mercer, she said. Are you telling me to get on that stage? A pause. A long one. No, he said, just that. One word. Landed like a stone dropped into still water. Are you telling me to stay? Another pause. His jaw moved. He was turning something over. She could see it. The effort of a man reaching for words that he had not used in a very long time, because he had not needed them. Because there had been no one to say them to. 8 years of no one to say them to. It's quiet here, he said finally. His voice was rough at the edges. Rougher than usual. I like the quiet, always have. He looked at the tree line, back at her. But I don't, he stopped. Started again. Your kind of quiet is different from empty. I hadn't. He stopped again. She waited. I hadn't known the difference, he said. Before, Rin stood in the mud. Her heart was doing something that was frankly unprofessional for this situation. Be sensible, she told herself. Person. You have things to do. You have a letter to write. You have documents that need to go to a solicitor in Boston. You have. Life up here is hard, Holt said. He said it the way he said things he needed to be sure about. Deliberately. One word following another, with weight behind each. Winters are long. The work doesn't stop by because the weather is bad. It isn't soft, what I'm describing. There's no silk dresses, no piano music, no dinner parties or social calls. He held her gaze. I can't offer you the life you were born to. The life I was born to, she said, was being sold to a man who forged my father's signature and then put his hand around my throat. He went very still. I'm not interested in that life, she said. I'm not interested in any version of that life. Silence. The creek. The mules. The drip from the eave. Holt reached up and took his hat off. Just took it off. Held it at his side. And for a moment he was not the mountain, not the immovable wall of quiet competence she'd spent 3 weeks learning to read. He was just a man. 58 years old, and tired in the way that grief makes tired, the deep-settled kind that sleep doesn't entirely reach. And he was looking at her like she was something he hadn't expected. He held out his hand, palm up. He didn't reach across the distance between them. He didn't step closer. He simply offered the space, his hand open at his side, between them. Like a question that was too important to phrase as a question, she looked at it, his hand. She had catalogued those hands too. The broken knuckles, healed slightly wrong. The scar at the base of his thumb. The callus on the inside of the first 2 fingers, right hand from a decade of rope work. The scrape on his left palm from the wood he'd split yesterday, still red at the edges. Working hands. Careful hands. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell and her basket of cinnamon. She thought about Edgar's gold ring catching the candlelight. She thought about her father's dragging D at the end of his name. The way it pressed down like he was always a little uncertain. And how the signatures on the lost contract had no uncertainty in them at all. She thought about a fever and a cloth soaked in cold water and the sound of a man sitting in the dark who had decided he was not going anywhere. She dropped her carpet bag. It landed in the mud with a soft, final sound. She crossed the distance between them. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, rough, absolutely certain. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since Denver. He squeezed her hand once. Then let go, because that was Holt. The feeling was real, and the gesture was real. And then he turned away from it, with the practicality of a man who had things to do, which was either maddening or exactly right. And she was beginning to understand it was both simultaneously. Mules are still hitched, he said. Yes, waste of an effort if nobody's going anywhere. It is, rather. He walked past her to the mules, began unrigging them with the same efficient sequence he used for everything. Unbuckled the traces, unhooked the harness pieces in the proper order. Wren picked up her carpet bag, walked back to the cabin, set the bag inside the door. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around it. The rocking chair, the table, the stove, the shelf with its organized jars, the cot, the curtain. The whetstone on the bench, properly oiled and stored. She walked to the stove, checked the coals, added 2 pieces of wood and adjusted the damper. She picked up the iron skillet. Her grip was right. Thumb wrapped under, fingers spread for balance, wrist taking the weight instead of just the palm. She set it on the grate. She found the salt pork in the cold box. She began to cook. She was slicing the onion when the mule screamed. Not the ordinary complaint of mules who are displeased with circumstances. A full, sharp, specific sound of animal alarm that cut through the cabin walls like the sound had edges. Wren set down the knife. She looked at the door. The mule went quiet, too quiet. She waited. Outside, the soft crunch of boot steps in melting snow. Holt's steps, she'd learned those. Deliberate, evenly weighted, a particular rhythm. But these were faster. And there was a different set underneath. More than one person. She stepped away from the stove. Her hand went to the shelf to the right of the door. She wasn't sure what she was reaching for until her fingers closed on the cold brass handle of her letter opener. Sitting where she'd left it when she unpacked 3 weeks ago. Still dull. Still useless. Still hers. The door opened. Holt. His face was arranged in the particular blankness that she was beginning to understand was not the absence of something but the active suppression of it. The face of a man pressing everything down so nothing gets out. Behind him, 4 men. One she recognized as the deputy from Coldwater Creek, the one who had looked at her in his office and put his hat back over his face. He looked different now, smaller somehow and twitchier. Like a man who had made a decision he was no longer sure about. The other 3 were hired. She could see it immediately. Not lawmen, not ranch hands. The particular blankness of men who did whatever the money required and found it easier not to think too hard about what was. And behind, Edgar Price, Navy suit. No, not navy. Dark, charcoal. Road dusty at the hem but otherwise impeccable. Because Edgar was always impeccable, it was one of his talents. Appearing unaffected by whatever circumstances lesser people found difficult. He had a greatcoat over his arm, and a hat that belonged in a Denver drawing room, and absolutely nowhere on this mountain. He looked exactly the same. That was the worst thing about it. He looked exactly the same as he always had, pleasant, composed, the particular quality of a man who was used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. Without being asked, his eyes found her immediately, and he smiled. "There she is," he said, not loud. Edgar was never loud. The warmth in his voice was the exact texture she remembered. The pleasant, reasonable warmth that sounded like caring and was something else entirely. Her body knew. That was the thing about the body. It remembered before the mind caught up. Her shoulders started to pull in. Her chin wanted to drop. The folding. The preemptive, habitual, learned folding. She felt it happening. And she stopped it, deliberately, one choice. Conscious. Shoulders back. Chin level. No, Holt was standing to her left, between her and the door. He had not moved to stand in front of her. He was simply there. Present. The way a wall is present. You don't lean on it to prove it's solid. It just is, Edgar, she said. Wren. He looked around the cabin. The assessment was quick and complete. Rustic, he said. I'm glad you found shelter. That storm must have been frightening. Not particularly, she said. A flicker. Something moving behind his eyes. We've been worried, he said. I've been worried. The circumstances under which you left were... He paused. Chose his word. Unclear? They were very clear to me. You were upset. Understandably, you'd misread some documents. I didn't misread them. Silence. The deputy shifted his weight near the door. One of the hired men coughed. Edgar's hands were at his sides. Still, she looked at them. The gold ring. Right where she remembered. Wren, he said, and the warmth in his voice dropped about 1 degree. This has gone far enough. Whatever you think you found, whatever story you've been telling yourself up here. I haven't been telling stories, she said. I've been thinking. I've had a considerable amount of time to think. Then come home and we can discuss it properly. This one's mine, she said. He blinked. So did Holt, she thought, though she couldn't see his face from this angle. Edgar looked at her. The pleasantness was doing more work now. Visible effort if you knew how to look. I beg your pardon. I said this conversation is mine. She kept her voice level, even. She was thinking of Holt's voice, actually, the quality of it, the way it carried weight without volume. She was trying to borrow that. You came up here for something. I know what it is. And I think you should hear what I have to say before you make any further decisions. Edgar smiled. Of course, he said. The smile of a man humoring someone. She reached into her dress, pulled out the oilcloth packet, unwrapped it. Carefully. She kept her hands steady through nothing but will, because there was some adrenaline happening in her chest that was, frankly, taking up more space than she'd prefer, but her hands were steady because she told them to be. She held up the documents. Edgar looked at them. And for one moment, one single, honest moment, the pleasantness dropped completely off his face. She saw what was underneath. These are the original surveying contracts, she said, the mineral rights transfers. The ones with my father's signature. She turned the top page toward him. Which isn't my father's signature, I know his handwriting, she said. I grew up watching him sign his name. He pressed too hard at the end. Made the D drag down, every time. Without exception, she looked at the documents. Then at Edgar. These signatures have even pressure, beginning to end. My father didn't write them. The deputy had gone very still near the door. One of the hired men took a small step back. Almost involuntary. You're a young woman, Edgar said, making accusations you don't understand the consequences of. I'm a young woman, she said, who has had 3 weeks in a quiet cabin to read these documents approximately 40 times and write out every question I would need. Answered by a competent solicitor. She tapped the oilcloth. I have the questions. I have the documents. And I have, as it happens, a great deal of time now that I'm not spending managing your household and attending your dinner parties. Edgar stepped forward one step. Toward her, Holt moved. Not dramatically, not fast, just shifted. One step, so that he was standing slightly in front of and to the left of Wren. The geometry of it was simple and clear. To get to her, Edgar would have to go through Holt. Edgar looked at Holt. Holt looked at Edgar. The deputy cleared his throat. Mr. Price, I think. Be quiet, Wade, Edgar said. Holt said nothing. He didn't need to. He was 58 years old and built like something that had grown out of this mountain. And he was looking at Edgar Price with the specific, patient expression of a man who has made certain calculations and is entirely comfortable with the results. Edgar held his gaze for 5 seconds, then looked away. That was the thing about Holt. He never blinked first. Not because he was performing toughness. Because he had genuinely run out of things to be afraid of a long time ago, and Edgar Price could sense that. The way animals can sense things that the people have to reason their way to. You're making a significant mistake, Edgar said. To Wren, not to Holt. He'd stopped looking at Holt. Those documents won't survive legal scrutiny. My solicitors, your solicitors are welcome to look at them, Wren said. So is the Federal Land Office. So is the Denver District Attorney. I have, she said, been thinking about who else should see these. I have a list. You don't have the standing to. I'm Edmund Ashford's daughter, she said, his only heir. I have standing to challenge every transaction made against his estate. And I will. She wrapped the documents back in the oilcloth, tucked them back against her ribs. The deputy was looking at the floor. He had the air of a man who had accepted money for a task that seemed straightforward and was discovering it was not straightforward at all, and was thinking about the various consequences of various decisions he might now make. The 3 hired men had moved, incrementally, back toward the door, not leaving, just farther from the center of things. Edgar looked at Wren, a long, cold, calculating look. You were always too clever, he said. Yes, she said. You counted on that changing. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite anger, not quite admiration, something colder. He put on his hat. This isn't over, he said. Holt spoke for the first time in minutes. No, he said. But you are. Edgar looked at him. Holt looked back. 5 seconds. 10. Edgar turned, walked to the door. The deputy stepped aside without being asked. The three hired men went first, their boots on the porch, down the steps, the sounds moving away through the clearing. The deputy paused in the doorway. He looked at Wren, then at Holt. "Mr. Mercer," he said. A nod. Awkward. The nod of a man acknowledging that he has been on the wrong side of something and doesn't have a better move available. Holt said nothing. The deputy left. The door closed. The sounds outside. Boots in mud. Horses. The clinking of bridles. Voices, low, without the words. And then the specific rhythm of horses moving away. Down mountain. Swallowing the sound. The way the mountain swallowed everything eventually. Gone. Wren stood in the middle of the cabin. She was shaking. Not from fear, or not entirely. From the effort of not shaking for the last 15 minutes. The body had been keeping an invoice. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Breathed. Holt was still at the door. He hadn't moved since it closed. He was looking at the door like he was listening to what was happening on the other side of it. Cataloging it. The way he cataloged everything. Then he turned. He looked at her hands on the table. The slight tremor in them. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm aware. You all right?" She stopped. Took the question seriously. Considered her actual answer. "I think so." "Yes." She looked at her hands. "I've never done that before." "Done what?" Said any of that. She looked up out loud. To him. "I've said it to myself approximately 1,000 times. In my head." While I was smiling at his dinner parties, Holt walked to the stove. He picked up the iron skillet she'd left out on the grate, with the half-sliced onion still on the board. "Salt pork's going to burn," he said. She stared at him. "We've been standing here," she said in a rather significant, "onions, already brown at the edges." "Holt, Wren," she let out a breath. And then she started laughing. She hadn't expected it. It arrived from somewhere below planning, below control, below the careful management of appropriate responses. It came up her chest and out of her throat. And it wasn't the polished laugh of a drawing room. It was the real kind, the slightly helpless kind, the kind that comes when your body finally releases something it's been carrying. So long it had forgotten. It was carrying it. Holt watched her laugh. His face did something it almost never did. It gave way, just at the edges. "Just enough. The onion," he said. "I'll get the onion," she said, still laughing a little, and she pushed off the table and went to the stove. They ate in the usual silence. Except it was different now. She couldn't have explained the difference. The sounds were the same. Fork on tin, fire in the stove, the mules in the lean-to, the creek. But the silence had a quality it hadn't had before. A texture. Like something that had been held taut had finally been allowed to go slack. Not limp, not empty. Just. No longer straining. There was work ahead. She knew that. The documents, the letters. The voice she'd been told her whole life to keep modest and contained. She was going to use it. But not today. Today she ate salt pork and fried bread in a small cabin on a Colorado mountain, and the smoke went straight up the chimney, and the man across the fire didn't ask her to explain herself or justify anything, or be smaller than she was. She ate everything on her plate. Later, in the long blue quiet of late afternoon, she was at the window again. The clearing showed the marks of horses, 4 sets of tracks leading in, 4 sets leading out. Already the melt was softening the edges. By tomorrow they'd be indistinct. By the day after, the thaw would take them entirely. Gone. She pressed her hand to the glass. "He'll send someone else," she said. Holt was at the workbench, cleaning the rifle. The familiar routine of it. Strip, wipe, oil. "Probably," he said. "Not through the canyon, not if they're smart." He ran the cloth down the barrel. Men who've never been up this mountain tend to underestimate how long it takes to get anywhere, and how fast the weather changes. "And if they're not smart, then they'll come up the canyon," he said. "And I'll know they're coming before they're halfway up." She believed him, not because he was reassuring her. He wasn't doing that. Holt didn't reassure. He stated facts. And the facts were reassuring, or they weren't depending on the situation. And he seemed comfortable with either outcome. She believed him because he was a man who had spent 8 years learning this mountain, the way she had once learned her father's household. Quietly, completely, until the knowledge was in the body and not just the mind. "There's the matter of a solicitor," she said. "Stage comes through Coldwater Creek twice a week in summer," he said. "Once the canyon clears, I'll need to write letters. I have paper." Somewhere, a pause. He sounded faintly uncertain about the paper, which was the most uncertain she'd heard him about anything. "Might need to look. I found it," she said. "Third drawer. Wrapped in the same canvas as your." She stopped. "He set the rifle down as your badge," she finished. He was quiet. "I thought it might be good for something," he said. "The paper." Eventually, he picked the rifle up again. Hadn't found a use for it yet. She looked at the back of his head, the gray at his temples, the way his shoulders sat, the particular set of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had gotten so accustomed to the weight he no longer noticed it, except when he put it down. "Holt," he set the rifle down again. "You could put the badge back on," she said. "If you wanted to." She chose each word carefully. "The canyon needs someone. The territory needs someone. There are women in towns like Coldwater Creek who need someone to know what you know." A pause. "You don't have to stay up here forever to prove something." Silence. The fire. "The creek, or you could stay up here," she said. "That's also a choice. A real one. Not a punishment." He turned around. He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for," he said. "About 3 days," she said. "Since the storm broke." He looked at the rifle, on the bench. The badge was in the drawer. She could feel the weight of it from across the room somehow. Small. Silver. Scratched over in anger, and then kept anyway. "I don't know," he said. And it was the most open thing she had ever heard him say. Not an answer. Not a decision. Just the plain truth of a man who genuinely did not know yet, and was admitting it. Something shifted in his face. The same thing she'd seen the night she'd said, "Ruth would have wanted you to stop punishing yourself." Something going soft at the edges. Not weakness. Just the particular vulnerability of a person who has been looked at clearly and not found wanting. "I'll think on it," he said. "Good," she said. "I'll start the beans." He almost laughed. She was fairly certain. She was watching closely, and the quality of what happened to his face in that moment. The slight exhale, the crinkle at the corners of those flint-chip eyes, the way his shoulders dropped about half an inch. She was fairly certain that was a laugh, contained. But real. She turned to the stove. That evening, the light lasted longer than it had in weeks. February giving way to something. Not spring, not yet. The mountain wouldn't call it spring for another 2 months. But the quality of the late light was different. The angle of it, lower and more golden, finding its way through the west-facing window and laying a long rectangle of warmth across the cabin floor. Wren sat in the rocking chair. She had paper on her knee. The kind that had been in the third drawer wrapped in canvas. Good quality, slightly yellowed with age but serviceable. She had found the pen in the same drawer and the ink in the shelf behind the Bible, and she was composing the first letter to the solicitor in Boston. Holt was at the table. He had the badge out, not wearing it, not putting it anywhere, just holding it in his hand, turning it over, looking at the engraving, then the scratched back, then the front again. She watched him out of the corner of her eye while she wrote. He set it down, face up. On the table in front of him, left it there. She looked back at her letter. "Dear Mr. Hartwell," she wrote, "I am writing to you regarding the estate of my late father, Edmund Ashford, and certain documents that have come to my attention which I believe require immediate legal review." She paused. She looked at the badge on the table. Face up, the engraving catching the last of the evening light. She looked at the man who had put it there. She went back to her letter. "I am currently residing in the mountains west of Coldwater Creek, Colorado Territory." She wrote, "And I have time and evidence, and the full intention of using both." She sealed the letter. The light went gold and then amber, and then the particular deep blue of mountain dusks. She set the letter on the shelf by the door. Holt looked at the badge one more time, Didn't put it on, didn't say anything about it, just put it in his pocket. Close. Available. Going to need an early start, he said. I'll have the coffee on, she said. He ate the rest of his beans. She ate hers. The stars, through the window, multiplied until the sky was full of them, more than she had ever seen at once. The particular abundance of a winter sky, at altitude after a long storm. Every one of them sharp and clean, and exactly where it was supposed to be. She washed the plates. He banked the fire. She took down her hair. He checked the bolt on the door, the same sequence it had been for 3 weeks. The rhythm of two people in a small space who had stopped negotiating each step because the steps had become simply theirs. She went behind the curtain, sat on the edge of the small cot, looked at the worn bear on the pillow, looked at the small buckled shoes on the floor. Billy, she thought. Not sadly, just his name. Present in the room the way he had always been, she thought. I'll learn how to exist in a space where you were. She believed that was possible now. She lay down, pulled the blanket up. The fire from the main room cast a warm line under the curtain, beyond the curtain. The sound of Holt settling into the cot. The rope springs. The long exhale of a man lying down after a long day. And then the particular quality of silence that was a person falling asleep. Not absence, not empty, but inhabited. She stared at the low ceiling. 1 month ago, she thought, you were in Denver. In a house that wasn't yours, about to marry a man who thought you were furniture, and now, she listened to the fire, to the mountain, to the breathing of the man in the next room. Now she closed her eyes, she slept, morning. Came the way it always came at altitude, fast and without apology. The window went from black to gray to white in the space of 20 minutes. The cold of the pre-dawn, the specific cold of the mountain, just before the sun clears the eastern ridge, which was the coldest cold and the most honest cold, the cold that didn't pretend it wasn't cold, came through the thin walls and announced itself. She was already awake. She dressed, quickly, efficiently. Boots laced correctly, the technique she'd been refining since Holt showed her the proper way to tighten them for walking on uneven ground. Navy dress, still somewhat compromised. Still not entirely willing to forgive what it had been through, she came out from behind the curtain. Holt was at the table. He had the badge on. She stopped. He was looking at it on his chest. The look of a man checking something in a mirror, except there was no mirror. Just his own assessment, conducted by feel and memory. He looked up. She didn't say anything. He didn't explain anything. Coffee's on, he said. I see that, she said. She poured 2 cups, brought his to the table, set it in front of him. He looked at the badge, looked at the coffee, looked at her. Going to be a cold morning, he said. For the ride down. I'll get my coat. You'll need gloves. There's a pair in the chest. I'll find them. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. His thumb moved once over the surface of the badge, not fidgeting, just touching it. The way you touch something you're reacquainting yourself with. She pulled on her coat, found the gloves in the cedar chest, heavy leather, sized for his hands, at least 2 sizes too large. She put them on anyway, held up both hands, looked at them. I look ridiculous, she said. You'll be warm, he said. That was not the question. That was the answer. She put the gloves in her coat pocket. She picked up the letter from the shelf, tucked it against her ribs next to the oilcloth packet. Everything important she carried on her body. She was beginning to think this was a sound policy. She looked around the cabin, the rocking chair, the stove with its careful damper setting, the shelf of jars, the workbench, the curtain over the small room with the small cot. This space she had arrived in starving and frozen and terrified. This space she had learned to move through without apologizing. Ready, she said. Holt stood. He picked up his hat, settled it, picked up his coat. He looked at her. She looked at him. Wren, he said Holt. A pause. Just the cabin, just the fire, just the two of them looking at each other in the clear morning light, which was the most honest light. Whatever happens with those documents, he said. Whatever they find, he met her eyes. You're not doing that alone. She held his gaze. I know, she said, and she did. She walked to the door. He followed. He unbolted it, pushed it open. The morning air hit them, cold and clean, and carrying the particular smell of melting snow and pine resin, and the creek running free below the tree line. The sky was the specific deep blue that came just after sunrise at altitude, before the day's clouds built. Every detail sharp, every tree edge exact. The mules were in the lean-to, already watching them. Two sets of dark eyes, patient and opinionated simultaneously, as mules tend to be. Wren stepped off the porch. Her boot landed in the mud. That sound the same wet sucking sound. Same as the first night. Same as every morning crossing from the porch to the lean-to. She didn't hesitate. She kept walking. Because that was what you did with mud. You didn't stop moving just because it grabbed at your boots. You pulled your foot free. You put it down again in the next place. You kept your weight forward, one step, and then the next. Behind her, she heard Holt's heavier footfall, steady, even, unhurried. Beside her soon, the mules made their opinion of the morning known. The smoke from the chimney rose behind them, thin and steady, the way it always did on mornings when the air was still and the mountain was at peace. And the road down the mountain was open, and the road was theirs.